Okay, let's unpack this. You've shared a fascinating stack of material with us, articles, research notes, taking us deep into one of the most pivotal and, well, complex moments in Indian history, the Revolt of 1857.
It really is.
Our mission today in this deep dive is to take everything you've gathered and really extract the most important nuggets of knowledge, the key insights, to help you get a comprehensive handle on this massive uprising quickly and thoroughly.
Absolutely. And what becomes clear when you look at these sources is that this event, often referred to simply as the Sepoy Mutiny, was clearly much, much more than just a military revolt.
Oh,
It
definitely.
was a widespread rebellion that shook British rule right to its core.
And here's where it gets really interesting, I think. This deep dive is going to explore the rebellion on multiple, often surprising levels. We're going to look at the dramatic outbreak in Meerut, the pattern of how it spread across North India,
Yeah, the speed is incredible.
and then delve into the fascinating evidence of how rebels actually communicated and organized, often in secret. We'll meet the diverse leaders who emerged, from figures tied to the old royal courts like the last Mughal emperor, all the way down to dynamic local figures like, village cultivators and religious preachers.
Right, a real spectrum of leadership.
We'll also explore the powerful, sometimes unsettling role that rumors and fears played, including that infamous story about the greased cartridges.
That one's crucial.
And take a special look at the kingdom of Awadh, where resistance was particularly fierce and honestly reveals so much about the causes of the revolt.
It really does. And critically, we'll examine what the rebels themselves articulated as their goals and grievances, drawing insights from their own limited but invaluable words like proclamations and petitions.
Trying to get their side of the story.
Exactly. Then we'll turn to the brutal British response to crush the uprising. And finally, explore how this monumental event was represented and remembered very differently by the British through their powerful visual propaganda and later by Indian nationalists, shaping how this story has been told ever since.
So what does all this mean for you listening? By the end of this deep dive, you'll have a much clearer picture of the complex tapestry of forces at play in 1857, the layered grievances, the sparks that ignited the fire, and the human experience of living through such a monumental upheaval.
You'll also see how the narratives around historical events, especially conflicts, are contested and shaped by different perspectives long after the fighting stops. It's an event with a contested legacy, and understanding it requires looking closely at the experiences and motivations of everyone involved.
Absolutely. Let's start right at the beginning, the flashpoint. Everything changed late in the afternoon on Sunday, May 10th, 1857, in the British military station, the cantonment in Meerut.
That's right. Suddenly, violently, the sepoys, the Indian soldiers serving in the British East India Company's army in the native infantry regiments there, broke out in mutiny.
Man, it wasn't contained.
No. What's striking is how quickly it spread. It wasn't just one regiment. It leaped across the lines to the cavalry and then burst out of the military area entirely, right into the city of Meerut itself. And crucial to note, ordinary people from the town and nearby villages joined the sepoys almost immediately.
Their first coordinated move, looking at the sources, was strategic and symbolic. They rushed to capture the bell of arms. Think of this as the central arsenal, the storeroom where weapons and ammunition were kept. Seizing that was essential for arming themselves.
Absolutely. Then their anger turned outwards. They specifically targeted white people, the British officers, their families, civilians, and proceeded to ransack and burn their bungalows and property.
And just as significant was their attack on the infrastructure of British rule, wasn't it?
Oh, definitely. They targeted government buildings. The record office, the jail, the court, the post office, the treasury. These were plundered and often set ablaze.
And the record burning.
Sure.
That feels deliberate.
Very. Burning the records was a powerful symbolic act, an attempt to literally erase the documentation, the paper trail of British administration and control over land, taxes, laws.
A key strategic move they made right at this initial stage was cutting the telegraph line to Delhi.
Yeah, that was smart.
Brilliant, because it instantly isolated the capital, preventing news of the mutiny from reaching the highest levels of British authority there immediately, buying the rebels crucial time.
As darkness fell on that chaotic Sunday, a contingent of these mutinous sepoys didn't stay put. They rode off through the night, heading directly for Delhi, the seat of the old Mughal Empire.
They arrived at the gates of the historic Red Fort in Delhi early the next morning, May 11th. It was the Muslim holy month of Ramzan, right?
That's right. And the aging last Mughal emperor, Bahadur Shah II, had just finished his pre-dawn prayers and meal when he heard the commotion outside.
And the sepoys who gathered below his window were surprisingly direct in explaining their actions.
They really were. They told him, and this is a powerful quote cited in the material, "We have come from Meerut after killing all the Englishmen there, because they asked us to bite bullets that were coated with the fat of cows and pigs with our teeth."
Wow. Straight to the point.
This has corrupted the faith of Hindus and Muslims alike. This single quote encapsulates the immediate trigger and the deep religious fear that was circulating.
Meanwhile, another group of sepoys also managed to enter Delhi, and just as in Meerut, they were joined by the ordinary people of the city.
Yeah, the sources note that Europeans were killed in large numbers, and the wealthy residents of Delhi were attacked and looted too. It wasn't just anti-British initially.
Within hours, the situation was clear. Delhi, the historical and symbolic heart of power in North India for centuries, was out of British control.
Completely. Some sepoys even entered the Red Fort itself, disregarding the elaborate court etiquette that normally governed access to the emperor. Just marched right in.
And they had one primary urgent demand for the emperor. They insisted that Bahadur Shah give them his blessings for their actions.
Bahadur Shah, finding himself suddenly surrounded by these armed, mutinous troops in his court, was initially horrified and actually rejected their plea.
Understandable, probably terrifying.
But, as the source recounts, he was under immense pressure and literally had no other option but to comply.
This forced compliance, this symbolic endorsement, was incredibly significant, though, wasn't it?
Hugely significant. The sources highlight that by carrying on the revolt in the name of the venerable Mughal emperor, the uprising gained a kind of legitimacy. It instantly elevated the mutiny from a simple act of military discipline to something potentially much larger, a challenge to the British claim to rule India itself. He was still the symbol, you see.
The immediate days after Delhi's fall, May 12th and 13th, were deceptively quiet in many parts of North India.
Right, there was a lag.
But once word spread carried by messengers, travelers, and rumor that Delhi had fallen and that the emperor had seemingly sanctioned the rebellion, events moved with astonishing swiftness.
It just exploded. Cantonment after cantonment. These British military stations throughout the fertile Gangetic Valley and west of Delhi rose in mutiny. The sources note a striking similar pattern in how these mutinies often began.
Almost like a script.
Yes, it was almost ritualistic in places.
Yeah.
The action started with a specific signal, perhaps the firing of the evening gun or the sounding of the bugle at an appointed time. Then, replicating the Meerut model, the sepoys would first seize the bell of arms, securing weapons and ammunition.
Weapons first.
Always. Immediately after, they'd plunder the treasury, cutting off British funds.
And the destruction followed the same script. They attacked government buildings, the jail, treasury, telegraph office, record room, the bungalows of British officers and civilians.
Burning all records. Again, that act of erasing British authority. The sources emphasize that in this initial phase, everything and everybody connected with the white man became a target.
And they weren't quiet about it either.
No. To galvanize wider support, proclamations were even put up in the cities, written in Hindi, Urdu, and Persian. These explicitly called upon the entire population, Hindu and Muslim alike, to unite and exterminate the Faranges.
And Farangi, that's the term for foreigners, often used negatively.
Exactly. It comes from Persian, widely used in Urdu and Hindi, and by this time it definitely carried a derogatory connotation. It meant the outsider, the alien.
What's absolutely crucial to understand here, I think, is how the nature of the uprising shifted when ordinary civilians joined the revolt.
Yes, that's a key turning point. The moment that happened, the targets broadened significantly beyond just the British. In major towns like Lucknow, Kanpur, and Bareilly, moneylenders and other wealthy individuals also became objects of rebel wrath.
And this wasn't random violence, was it?
No, the sources indicate that peasants in particular saw these groups not just as local exploiters, but also as collaborators and allies of the British. They had often benefited from the new British economic and land policies, sometimes at the expense of the cultivators.
So their houses were looted and destroyed as a result.
Frequently. It shows that this wasn't contained. The initial mutiny within the sepoy ranks rapidly transformed into a much wider rebellion.
The source material defines this stage as a general defiance of all kinds of authority and hierarchy.
Exactly. It was no longer just soldiers against their British officers. It was a widespread societal upheaval against multiple forms of perceived oppression, both foreign and local.
And the impact on British control was immediate and devastating.
Oh, completely. As one British officer observed, their rule in these vast areas of North India simply collapsed like a house made of cards during those swift, violent months of May and June 1857. The speed and scale of the uprising caught them entirely off guard.
But the story of the revolt wasn't just about these grand, sweeping military and political events. The sources also offer glimpses into how this massive upheaval affected ordinary daily life, especially in cities now under rebel control. Source 1, that report from the Delhi Urdu Akhbar newspaper.
Yes, from June 14th, 1857. It provides a really vivid human picture. It describes a complete breakdown in routine activities that we take for granted.
Like food.
Yeah, food became scarce and difficult to find in the markets. Vegetables like pumpkin, kaddu, and brinjal, banyan, were rare. Potatoes and yam, arvi, were stale and rotten. The better produce seemingly hoarded or earmarked for the select few, leaving the majority struggling.
And think about this detail. The water carriers, who were essential for supplying water in the city, stopped working.
Huge impact. For the Sherfas, the term used for the gentility or respectable classes, this was a mass's indignity. They were seen forced to do manual labor they'd never done before, carrying water in pails on their shoulders, just to manage basic household tasks like cooking and cleaning.
And there was also a deep, palpable fear of disease mentioned.
Yes, the report mentions that halal khors, righteous, have become haram khors, corrupt, suggesting a breakdown of social order, sanitation, and perhaps moral standards. This led to a prediction that an epidemic will spread all over the city, adding another layer of anxiety to an already desperate situation.
How does this kind of detail change your perception of the revolt? It wasn't just about battles and power struggles at the top.
No, it upended the most basic aspects of survival and dignity for city dwellers, highlighting the chaos and fear people lived with on a daily basis during this period. It makes the history feel very immediate and human.
It also serves as a reminder, as the note within the source material points out, that even contemporary newspaper reports reflect the prejudices and perspectives of their writers.
Exactly. So while invaluable, we read such accounts critically, understanding they are one specific view of events.
Okay, moving beyond the immediate outbreak and its human cost, the sources also hint at something deeper, potential coordination and planning behind the revolt's astonishingly swift spread.
Yeah, the similarity in the pattern of mutinies does suggest that there was some form of communication happening between different sepoy lines across distances.
Source 1.2 provides intriguing evidence for this, doesn't it?
It does. For instance, after one regiment, the 7th Awad Irregular Cavalry, refused the new cartridges in early May, they reportedly wrote to another, the 48th Native Infantry, saying they had acted for the faith and awaited the 48th's orders.
That sounds like more than just spontaneous action. It implies planning, discussion, maybe even a network.
It really does. Sepoys or emissaries were clearly moving between military stations, carrying messages and perhaps instructions.
Source 2 offers another fascinating, almost clandestine anecdote that points to this hidden network. The experience of Francois Siston, a native Christian police inspector in Sitapur.
Right. He was dressed in Indian clothes when he encountered a Muslim Tahsildar, a minor revenue collector from Bijnor.
And the Tahsildar, seeing Siston dressed in Indian clothes and perhaps sensing an alliance, immediately asked him about news from Awad, phrasing it like a secret greeting. How does the work progress, brother?
Siston, understandably cautious, gave a noncommittal reply, but the Tahsildar responded with confidence. Depend upon it, we will succeed this time. The direction of the business is in able hands.
Wow. What's so revealing about this brief exchange is how it suggests both the secrecy and the widespread nature of the planning.
Exactly. How did the Tahsildar identify Siston as a potential rebel sympathizer just by his appearance and possibly his origin from Awad? It strongly hints at an underground network, a shared understanding, perhaps even a coded language.
It also highlights a significant challenge for historians, though. Based on the documents that survived mostly British accounts, it's difficult to find direct, explicit answers about how exactly these overarching plans were made or who precisely constituted the Central Planning Committee, if one even existed.
It's often circumstantial evidence. However, one incident does shed light on how decisions were being made within the sepoy ranks. It involves Captain Hersey of the Awad Military Police.
What happened there?
During the mutiny, his own Indian subordinates protected him. But the nearby 41st Native Infantry, who had killed their own white officers, insisted that Hersey's men should do the same or hand him over.
So pressure from another regiment.
Yes. The military police refused to comply, and the matter was resolved not by an officer's order, but by a panchayat composed of native officers drawn from each regiment.
A panchayat. like a traditional council.
Exactly, a traditional village council or assembly for collective decision-making. Charles Bull, one of the early historians who chronicled the uprising, observed that such panchayats were a nightly occurrence in the Kanpur sepoy lines.
Nightly occurrences. That strongly suggests that many crucial decisions about the mutiny and rebellion were being taken collectively, through discussion and consensus among the Indian soldiers.
It really does. And that makes perfect sense when you consider the structure of the sepoy lines. Soldiers lived together, shared a common lifestyle, and often came from the same villages, even the same castes. They formed tight-knit communities within the cantonment.
So it's easy to imagine them meeting, discussing their grievances, and collectively deciding their course of action.
Absolutely, as the source materials put it quite powerfully. The sepoys were the makers of their own rebellion. They weren't just following orders, they were making them.
But for a movement this widespread to sustain itself and challenge a power like the British East India Company, leadership and some form of organization were absolutely essential, as the sources clearly demonstrate.
Definitely needed structure. An initial strategy that emerged was to turn to the erstwhile rulers, those who held legitimacy and authority in people's minds before the British conquest stripped them of power.
Like Badr Shah. As we saw right at the beginning, the Meerut sepoys immediately rushed to Delhi to appeal to him first.
And while his initial reaction was horror under pressure from the mutinous troops, he eventually agreed to lend his name, becoming the nominal leader of the rebellion, the symbolic figurehead.
This pattern was repeated in other centers of the revolt, though perhaps on a smaller scale. In Kanpur.
In Kanpur, the sepoys and the local populace together compelled Nana Sahib, who was the adopted son and successor to the last Peshwa, Bajirao II, to lead their uprising.
And in Jhansi, the famous Rani Lakshmi Bai.
She was initially hesitant, apparently, but popular pressure from her people ultimately forced her to assume leadership of the uprising there.
And in Ara, in Bihar, a local zamindar, a hereditary landlord named Kunwar Singh, was similarly pressured by his tenants and soldiers to lead.
Exactly. So you see this pattern of turning to established pre-British figures of authority.
In Awadh, which became a major hub of the rebellion, the memories of the beloved Nawab Wajid Ali Shah's deposition and the state's annexation just a year earlier were incredibly fresh and painful.
Very raw. So when British rule collapsed in Lucknow, the populace hailed the Nawab's young son, Birjis Qadr, as their leader.
This was deeply fueled by the widespread attachment people felt for the displaced Nawab, wasn't it?
Immensely. As a folk song in the sources laments, capturing the simple, profound sense of loss, the Honorable English came and took the country. Angres Bahadurain, Molkale Lino. This emotional connection was a powerful motivator.
But leadership wasn't limited to figures from the royal courts or the old aristocracy.
No, not at all. The message of rebellion and the call to arms were also carried by ordinary men and women, and significantly, sometimes by religious figures who commanded popular respect and authority.
Like the fakir in Meerut.
Yes. Reports from Meerut mentioned a fakir, a Muslim ascetic or mendicant, who rode on an elephant and was frequently visited by sepoys, perhaps offering spiritual guidance or encouragement for their actions.
And in Lucknow.
In Lucknow, after the state's annexation, many religious leaders and self-styled prophets began actively preaching jihad, a religious struggle or war against the British, urging the populace to rebel.
Beyond these, local leaders emerged who mobilized peasants, small zamindars, and even tribal groups. The sources provide fascinating details on two such figures, Shamal and Maulvi Ahmadullah Shah.
Let's start with Shamal. He was a jat cultivator from a large village in the Pargana of Barut in Uttar Pradesh. A Pargana was a historical administrative unit, like a cluster of villages.
And he had local influence.
Yes, he belonged to a clan whose kinship ties extended over 84 villages, the Charosis, in this area of fertile irrigated land. While many villagers here were prosperous, they felt oppressed by the British land revenue system.
The revenue demand, the Jumas, was incredibly high.
Exactly. And crucially, the collection methods were inflexible. This caused many cultivators to lose their land to outsiders, traders, and moneylenders who were better positioned to navigate the new British legal and economic system.
So Shamal saw this happening.
And he didn't just complain. He actively mobilized the headmen and cultivators of these 84 villages. He moved through the area at night, urging them to actively rebel against the British.
And this local revolt against the British quickly broadened, didn't it?
It did. It wasn't just about the British presence. It became a rebellion against all perceived signs of oppression and injustice in the area. Cultivators left their fields and specifically targeted and plundered the houses of moneylenders and traders, those seen as benefiting from the oppressive system.
And those who had lost land took it back.
Significantly, yes. They took the opportunity to seize it back. Shah Mal's actions were comprehensive. His men attacked government buildings. They destroyed a bridge over a river.
Why the bridge? Just disruption.
Partly to hinder British troop movements, but also because infrastructure like bridges and metalled roads were seen as symbols of the intrusive new British rule. They were digging up roads, too, for the same reason.
He also actively disrupted British control.
Yes, by sending supplies to the sepoys, fighting in Delhi, and stopping all official British communication in this region. Locally, because of his actions and leadership, he was acknowledged as the Raja, a king or ruler.
He set up his own Hall of Justice.
In a seized English officer's bungalow, yes. Settling disputes, dispensing judgments, creating a local intelligence network to monitor British movements. For a time, the people in his area genuinely felt that the Firangi Raj was over, and their Raj had come. A tangible sense of reclaiming control.
But he died fighting.
Tragically, yes. In July 1857.
Then there is Maulvi Ahmadullah Shah. What was his story?
He was educated in Hyderabad and became a respected preacher. From as early as 1856, well before the main outbreak, he was traveling across North India, moving from village to village, preaching jihad against the British and actively urging people to rebel.
He was quite a striking figure, apparently.
Very. Traveling in a palanquin with drummers ahead of him, earning him the popular and evocative name Danka Shah, essentially, the Maulvi with the drum.
And the British noticed him.
Oh, yes. British officials became increasingly panicked by his activities because thousands of people, particularly Muslims, began following him, many seeing him as an inspired prophet.
He was jailed briefly.
In Faizabad in 1857, yes. But upon his release, he was immediately elected as the leader by the mutinous 22nd Native Infantry Regiment there. He proved to be a formidable military leader, playing a significant role, even fighting in the Battle of Chinha, where the British forces suffered a notable defeat.
And his reputation grew.
Immensely. His reputation for courage, power, and leadership grew. The sources note that many people believed he was invincible, that he possessed magical powers, and simply could not be killed by the British.
Whether true or not, that belief itself is powerful.
Absolutely. This widespread popular belief became a crucial foundation for his authority and influence among the rebels.
Thinking about figures like Shah Mal and Maulvi Ahmadullah Shah, it raises a really interesting question. Why do you think ordinary people were so drawn to these leaders? Their authority wasn't based on royal lineage like Bahadur Shah or Nana Sahib.
No, Shah Mal was a cultivator who became a local administrator and military figure, while Maulvi Ahmadullah Shah was a religious preacher who became a military commander.
So what did they represent to the people who followed them?
It seems their authority stemmed from their direct action against perceived oppression, their connection to the common people's grievances, their ability to mobilize people locally, and in the Maulvi's case, perhaps spiritual conviction and charisma played a huge role too. They were leaders who emerged from the struggle, in a way.
So we've covered the outbreak, the spread, the organization, and the diverse leaders. But underpinning all of it were the immediate triggers and the deep-seated fears that acted as fuel for this fire.
Yes, the rumors and prophecies. They played an absolutely disproportionate role in igniting and spreading the rebellion.
As we heard the sepoys tell Bahadur Shah, the central rumor, the one that became the immediate spark, was about the new Enfield rifles and their cartridges.
Right. These cartridges were greased, and the soldiers had to bite off the paper casing before loading the rifle. The rumor, which spread like wildfire through the sepoy lines across North India, was that the grease used was made from the fat of cows and pigs.
Which was explosive, because
Because for Hindus, the cow is sacred, and consuming beef or its products is religiously forbidden. For Muslims, the pig is considered unclean, and consuming pork or its products is similarly forbidden. The fear was profound and immediate, that by simply biting these cartridges, their caste purity and their religion would be destroyed, rendering them outcasts.
And the British couldn't stop this rumor?
No. The sources explicitly state that no amount of assurances from British officers could stop its circulation and the fear it spread among the sepoys. Once this rumor took hold, trust evaporated, and suspicion turned into certainty.
We even have a potential origin story for this specific rumor noted in Captain Wright's report.
Yes, it's an anecdote from the magazine in Dum Dum, where the cartridges were manufactured. A low-caste Khalasi, likely a laborer or helper, asked a Brahmin sepoy for water from his vessel. The Brahmin refused, citing the need to protect his caste purity.
And the Colosse's response?
Reportedly, perhaps in frustration, he retorted, "You will soon lose your caste, as ere long you will have to buy cartridges covered with the fat of cows and pigs."
Wow, whether that exact exchange happened or not.
Exactly. While the source acknowledges not knowing the absolute veracity of this specific interaction, the power of the story lies in how it perfectly tapped into existing anxieties about caste purity and British interference, especially given the close living conditions and caste consciousness within the sepoy lines.
But this wasn't the only rumor circulating, was it? The fear was broader.
Much broader. Another deeply unsettling rumor claimed the British government had a deliberate, sinister conspiracy to destroy the caste and religion of all Indians. This particular rumor claimed the British were mixing the bone dust of cows and pigs into the flour, atta, sold in the open market.
Bone dust in the flour, that's horrifying.
It was meant to be. The reaction was immediate and widespread. Sepoys and ordinary people alike refused to touch the atta. This wasn't just about cartridges for soldiers, it was about the food staples for the entire population.
So there was widespread fear and suspicion that the British wanted to convert Indians to Christianity.
Yes, panic spread incredibly fast, affecting cities and villages alike, despite any efforts by British officials to calm the situation.
Adding another layer of foreboding were prophecies.
Right. One widely circulated prophecy predicted that British rule would end exactly 100 years after their victory at the Battle of Plassey, which had cemented British power in Bengal.
And that centenary date was?
June 23, 1857, just weeks after the Meerut outbreak. This added a sense of destiny, a belief that the time for change for the end of British rule had arrived.
And then there's the enduring mystery of the chapatis.
Ah, yes, the chapatis. Reports came in from across North India describing a strange, silent phenomenon, the distribution of chapatis, or flatbreads, from village to village.
How did it work?
One person would arrive at night, hand a chapati to the village watchman, and instruct him to make 5 more and pass them on to the watchman of the next village, and so on, silently spreading.
Do we know what it meant?
The sources admit that the meaning and purpose of this distribution was not clear and is not clear even today. Historians still debate its significance. Was it a signal? A warning? A religious act? We just don't know for sure.
But what is clear is its impact.
Undeniably. It was a tangible sign, a silent message passing through communities that something significant was happening. People interpreted it as an omen of an upheaval, a quiet warning or preparation for change.
So the critical question arises. Why were people so ready to believe these rumors, even those that seem strange to us now, like bone dust and flour or magical chapatis?
That's the core question. The sources provide essential context here. To understand this, you have to look into the minds of people who believe them, their fears and apprehensions, their faiths and convictions.
Rumors don't circulate widely in a vacuum, do they?
Not at all. They only take hold and spread with remarkable speed when they resonate with the deeper fears and suspicions of people.
And these fears weren't conjured out of thin air in 1857. The sources explicitly connect the rumors to a long series of British policies stretching back decades.
Yes, starting notably in the late 1820s under Governor-General Lord William Bentinck. These policies were aimed at what the British saw as reforming or civilizing Indian society along Western lines.
These reforms included introducing Western education, ideas, and institutions.
Right. The British established English medium schools, colleges, and universities teaching Western subjects, which many Indians saw as an attempt to undermine traditional Indian learning and culture.
Alongside education, laws were passed that directly interfered with Indian social customs.
Yes, for instance, the abolition of sati, widow immolation, in 1829, and the law permitting Hindu widow remarriage were seen by many as direct assaults on their socio-religious practices, dictated by foreign rulers who did not understand or respect their traditions.
Compounding this was the aggressive policy of annexation.
A huge factor. The British systematically took over Indian kingdoms and principalities like Satara, Nagpur, Shansi, and most recently, Awadh, often on questionable pretexts like alleged misgovernment or refusing to recognize adopted heirs, a traditional Indian practice for succession.
Once a kingdom was annexed, the British imposed their own system.
Their own administration, their laws, and crucially, their own methods of land settlement and revenue collection. This often drastically altered existing patterns of landholding and economic life.
So the cumulative impact of these policies across North India was profound and deeply unsettling.
Absolutely. People felt that all that they cherished and held sacred, from kings and socio-religious customs to patterns of landholding and revenue payment, was being destroyed and replaced by a system that was more impersonal, alien, and oppressive.
And Christian missionary activities aggravated this perception.
Significantly. Although not officially state-sponsored conversion, the presence and proselytizing efforts of missionaries, sometimes perceived as being supported by the British authorities, further fueled the deep-seated fear that the ultimate British goal was forced conversion to Christianity.
So in this environment of widespread apprehension and disruption, this situation of uncertainty, where people already feared that their religions, their customs, their land, and their very way of life were under systematic attack.
Rumors like the greased cartridges or poison flower didn't seem outlandish. They resonated deeply because they confirmed people's worst fears about the British intention to destroy their identity. They spread, as the sources say, with remarkable swiftness, precisely because the ground had been prepared by decades of mistrust.
How does understanding the context of these British reforms and annexations make the belief in seemingly strange or unbelievable rumors much more understandable to you?
It shows that the rumors weren't just random fears. They were symptoms of much deeper, long-standing anxieties about the corrosive impact of British rule on Indian society. They landed on fertile ground.
Now, let's zoom in on one specific region, the Kingdom of Awadh. The sources repeatedly highlight Awadh as a major center where the drama of 1857 unfolded with particular intensity and where the resistance was incredibly fierce and long-lasting.
Yes, it's a microcosm that reveals so much about the revolt's underlying causes.
Governor-General Lord Dalhousie, a key figure in British expansion, described Awadh as early as 1851 with predatory anticipation. A cherry that will drop into our mouth one day.
A chilling phrase. His desire was realized just 5 years later when it was formally annexed by the British in 1856.
The British presence wasn't new, though. A subsidiary alliance had been imposed on Awadh back in 1801.
Right. Remember, under these alliances, Indian rulers were forced to disband their own military forces, allow British troops to be permanently stationed in their kingdom, and increasingly act on the advice of the British resident stationed at their court, effectively losing sovereignty.
Stripped of his own independent military power, the Nawab of Awadh became increasingly reliant on the British for internal law and order.
And lost effective control over powerful local chiefs and landholders, the Talukars. Meanwhile, the British grew increasingly interested in Awadh's fertile land, perfect for valuable cash crops like indigo and cotton, and its strategic location as a vital market for British goods in Upper India.
By the 1850s, with most of the subcontinent under some form of British control, taking over Awadh was seen by many British officials as simply completing the territorial annexation process.
The final piece, in their eyes. Dalhousie's policy of annexation caused disaffection across India, but the sources are emphatic. Nowhere was the disaffection more profound or widespread than in the recently annexed Kingdom of Awadh, right in the heart of the region that supplied the Bengal army with most of its soldiers.
The official reason given for the annexation was the plea of misgovernment by Nawab Wajid Ali Shah, but the sources strongly contradict this British narrative.
They argue it was based on the false assumption that the Nawab was unpopular. In reality, the sources suggest he was widely loved.
Really? How do we know?
When he was dethroned and exiled to Calcutta in 1856, his departure caused immense grief. People reportedly followed him crying and singing songs of lamentation, demonstrating genuine, widespread affection.
A contemporary observer captured this sense of loss with a powerful description.
Yes, the life was gone out of the body, and the body of this town had been left lifeless. There was no street or market and house which did not wail out the cry of agony and separation of Jani Alam. Jani Alam meaning soul of the world, a popular nickname for the Nawab.
And that folk song we mentioned earlier, The Honorable English Came and Took the Country, also perfectly captures this emotional upheaval.
It does. And this wasn't just emotional. The dissolution of the Nawab's court and its vibrant culture had immediate, devastating material consequences for a huge range of people. Musicians, dancers, poets, artisans of various crafts, cooks, household retainers, court officials, all lost their livelihoods overnight when the center of patronage vanished. Their world was literally dismantled.
The sources argue that in Awadh, the grievances weren't isolated. There was a clear, interconnected chain of grievances that linked the prince, the powerful Talukars, the peasants, and even the sepoys.
Yes, a chain reaction. In different ways, all these groups came to identify the Firangi Raj, British rule, with the end of their world a fundamental breakdown of the things they valued, respected, and held dear.
Let's look specifically at the Tilakars. Before the British, they were incredibly powerful.
Immensely, they controlled land and wielded significant political and military power for generations within their territories. They maintained armed retainers, built forts, and enjoyed a high degree of autonomy under the Nawab, who, while sovereign, often depended on their local influence.
Some were like minor kings in their own right.
Some of the largest Tolakars commanded as many as 12,000 foot soldiers, while even smaller ones might have around 200. So yes, considerable power.
The British, however, were unwilling to tolerate this kind of power.
Not at all. Immediately after annexing Awadh, they systematically disarmed the Talokars and destroyed their forts, dismantling their independent military capability.
Then came the British land revenue policy, which further devastated their position. The Summary Settlement of 1856.
Yes, this was crucial. It was implemented based on the British assumption, perhaps flawed, that the Talukars were simply interlopers who had gained their power and land holdings illegitimately through force or fraud rather than through legitimate historical rights or service to the Nawab.
So the settlement aimed to remove them.
Wherever possible, yes. It aimed to settle the land directly with the cultivators or smaller landholders. The figures cited in the sources are quite striking. Before the British takeover, Talukars held hereditary rights over 67% of the villages in Awadh.
And after?
After the summary settlement, this was drastically reduced to just 38%. Talukars in southern Awadh were particularly hard hit, losing over half their villages.
British officers genuinely believed this policy would benefit the peasants, right?
They did. They thought removing oppressive intermediaries, settling land with the actual owners, would reduce exploitation and simultaneously increase state revenue by cutting out the middleman.
But the sources state quite clearly that this did not happen in practice.
No. While revenue for the state did increase sometimes by an astonishing 30 to 70% due to deliberate overassessment in many areas, the burden of demand on the peasants did not decline. In fact, for many peasants, the revenue demand was higher and collection more rigid than under the Talukars or the Nawab system.
So, contrary to British expectations, neither Talukars nor peasants had any reasons to be happy with the annexation and the subsequent land settlement.
None at all. The dispossession of the Talukars also meant the breakdown of the existing social order and the disruption of the traditional ties of loyalty and patronage between peasants and landholders.
Weren't the Talukars often seen as oppressors themselves?
They could be, certainly, but they were often also seen by their peasants as generous father figures, in a way part of the same social fabric, someone who might provide support, loans, or reduce demands in times of hardship or natural disaster. There was a relationship, however unequal.
And under the new British system,
Peasants found themselves directly exposed to overassessment of revenue and inflexible methods of collection. There was little room for negotiation, no guarantee of reduced demand during bad harvests, and no possibility of postponing collection. The system was impersonal and rigid.
this complex web of grievances explains why, in areas like Awadh, the resistance was so intense and long-lasting.
Exactly. The fighting during the revolt was often carried out jointly by the dispossessed Talukars and their loyal peasants. Many Talukars who remained loyal to the Nawab joined his wife, Begum Hazrat Mahal, in Lucknow, leading forces against the British.
Source 4 provides a truly powerful anecdote about a Talukar named Hanwant Singh, the Raja of Kalakankar.
Yes, a remarkable story. During the chaos of the mutiny, he gave shelter to a British officer, ensuring his safety.
But when the officer was leaving, Hanwant Singh's parting words were incredibly direct.
Incredibly. He said, and this is a quote preserved in the source, "Sahib, your countrymen came into this country and drove out our king. At one blow you took from me lands which from time immemorial had been in my family. I submitted. Suddenly misfortune fell upon you. The people of the land rose against you. You came to me whom you had despoiled. I have saved you. But now I march at the head of my retainers to Lucknow to try and drive you from the country."
Wow. What does this tell us about the Talukar perspective? He clearly links the personal loss of his ancestral land to the deposition of the king.
Absolutely. He views both as unjust acts by the British. And when he says the people of the land, who do you think he includes? It seems to encompass not just other dispossessed landholders, but potentially the very peasants and armed retainers who stood with him, ready to follow him into battle against the British.
His willingness to save the officer while simultaneously declaring war highlights the complex loyalties and deep anger of the time.
It really does. Which brings us to the final crucial link in that chain of grievances in Awad, the sepoy himself.
Because peasant grievances were carried over into the sepoy lines.
Exactly. Because the vast majority of the sepoys of the Bengal army were recruited from the villages of Awad and eastern Uttar Pradesh.
The composition of the Bengal army heavily favored recruits from these areas.
Yes, many of whom were Brahmins or from other what the British considered upper castes. Awad in particular was famously described as the nursery of the Bengal army because so many soldiers came from there.
There were existing sources of discontent among the sepoys before 1857 issues like pay, leave.
Yes, relatively low pay compared to their British counterparts, and increasing difficulty getting leave to visit their homes and families.
But a truly crucial shift, according to the sources, happened in the relationship between white officers and their Indian sepoys from the 1840s onwards.
A definite deterioration. Before that, many officers maintained closer, more friendly relations. They might share leisure activities, speak Hindustani fluently, understand and respect Indian customs, and act as firm but sometimes paternalistic disciplinarian figures.
But from the 1840s.
Driven by a growing imperialistic sense of superiority, a noticeable distance grew. British officers began treating sepoys increasingly as racial inferiors, sometimes even resorting to abuse and physical violence.
So trust eroded.
Completely. Trust, which is essential in a military hierarchy, was replaced by suspicion.
And the greased cartridge episode, which we discussed earlier as the immediate trigger, is presented in the sources as a classic example of this breakdown in trust.
Precisely. Because suspicion of the officers' intentions was already rife, their denials about the fact were simply not believed.
And here's the absolutely critical connection that made Awad so central to the revolt. The sepoys were not disconnected from their rural homes.
Not at all. They maintained strong links with their families and villages. Changes and threats perceived by their families in Awad, the dispossession of talukars, the overassessment of revenue, the fear of conversion were quickly transmitted back to the sepoy lines.
And vice versa. Sepoy fears went back to the villages.
Exactly. The sepoys' own fears about the cartridges, difficulties getting leave, or their officers' abusive behavior were communicated back to their villages during visits or through letters. It was a two-way street of grievance and anxiety.
So this deep mutual connection meant that when the sepoys in the cantonments finally mutinied,
they were joined very swiftly by their brethren in the villages, their families, their caste fellows, their friends, their fellow villagers who shared the same grievances against British land policy and perceived cultural interference.
It became a widespread phenomenon then.
Everywhere, peasants poured into towns and joined the soldiers and the ordinary people of the towns in collective acts of rebellion. The Sepoy Mutiny provided the catalyst, but the deep rural discontent, particularly in Awad, provided the massive popular support that turned it into a rebellion.
So we've explored how the rebellion started, who joined in, what grievances fueled the fire, and why Awad was so central. But a crucial, complex question remains. What did the rebels actually want? What was their vision for the future?
That's a difficult question for historians, as the sources highlight. We are heavily and inevitably dependent on what the British wrote about the rebellion.
Because few rebels could record their own version.
Exactly. Few rebels had the opportunity of recording their version of events, and most were illiterate. The documents we have that come directly from the rebel side are limited to a few proclamations, known as ishtihars, and some letters from leaders, and a handful of petitions or arzis.
The challenge, as noted in the discussion points, is that these limited rebel sources often reveal broad goals, while the extensive British sources tell us more about the minds of officials, their strategies, fears, and perspectives, rather than the rebels' explicit long-term aims or internal debates.
It's tricky. Despite these limitations, the available rebel proclamations offer a significant window into their perspective, particularly their vision of unity against British or Firangi rule.
These proclamations repeatedly appealed for unity to all sections of the population, irrespective of their caste and creed. It wasn't a call for just one group, it was for everyone.
And the sources point out that even proclamations issued by or in the name of Muslim princes, like Bahadur Shah, took care to address the sentiments of Hindus. They were consciously trying to build a broad front.
The rebellion was consistently framed as a war where both Hindus and Muslims had equally to lose or gain.
Yes, their shared world, their shared way of life was under threat, and they would either save it together or lose it together. That was the message.
They even appealed to history, didn't they?
They did, harking back to what they saw as the pre-British Hindu-Muslim past, glorifying a time of coexistence and shared culture, particularly under the Mughal Empire, which they positioned as a symbol of legitimate pre-British authority.
Bahadur Shah's own proclamation explicitly appealed for the fight to be carried out under the standards of both Muhammad and Mahavir.
Right, referencing both the Prophet Muhammad and the Jain Tirthankara Mahavir, symbolizing Hindu and Jain religious traditions alongside Islam. A very inclusive appeal.
What the sources describe as remarkable is how religious divisions were hardly noticeable during the uprising itself.
It seems this unity held strong despite deliberate British attempts to sow discord. The sources mention a specific example in Bareilly, where the British reportedly spent a large sum, R50,000, in December 1857 specifically to incite Hindus against Muslims, and this effort failed. The unity held.
One of the most important sources we have that lays out what the rebels wanted in detail is the Azamgarh Proclamation, issued on August 25, 1857.
Yes, Source 5. It's essentially a manifesto of rebel grievances and aspirations, and really one of the main sources of our knowledge about what the rebels wanted.
Its core message is a direct indictment of the British, whom it calls the infidel and treacherous English, claiming they are actively ruining the people of India.
It's a passionate call to arms, urging Hindus and Muslims alike, particularly the wealthy elites and those connected to the old royal families, to fight together for the public good.
The proclamation even draws on traditional Indian beliefs.
Yes, asserting, based on ancient works, both of the Hindus and Mohammedans, the writings of miracle workers and the calculation of the astrologers, that the British presence and influence in India was destined to end. This added a sense of divine or cosmic inevitability to their cause.
The power of the Azamgarh Proclamation lies in how it then lists specific grievances and promises tailored to different social groups, revealing the multifaceted nature of the opposition to British rule.
Exactly. Let's break that down. For the Zemindars, the hereditary landholders, their grievances were clear. The exorbitant revenue demands, or jumas, imposed by the British.
The humiliation of being ruined and disgraced by having their states publicly auctioned for arrears.
Being subjected to the indignity of being summoned and even arrested in court by common people, and the high costs associated with the British legal system, like stamps and court fees.
And the promises made to them under a restored Badshahi government rule under a king or emperor.
Late Jumas, guaranteed safety for their dignity and honor, and essentially absolute rule in his own zemindari within their traditional areas, a return to their former status.
Okay, what about the merchants?
Their complaints centered on economic exploitation. They resented the British monopoly on valuable trade goods like indigo, cloth, and articles imported by sea, leaving only less profitable, trifling trade to Indian merchants.
They were also angered by taxes on profits through postages, tolls, and subscriptions, and the threat of imprisonment and disgrace based on what they saw as worthless complaints within the British legal system.
Right. The proclamation promised that all these aforesaid fraudulent practices shall be dispensed with, and that trade of every article, without exception, would be open to native merchants. They were explicitly called upon to aid the cause with men and money.
Then public servants. They felt they had lost respect, pay, and influence under the British.
Deeply. They stated that all the posts of dignity and emolument, all the important and well-paid positions were exclusively reserved for Englishmen, leaving Indians with low status and low pay.
And the promise to those who would abandon their loyalty to the English and side with the Badshahi government.
Higher salaries initially set at 200-300 rupees per month, and the entitlement to high posts in the future. A chance for advancement denied under the British.
What about the artisans? Their grievance sounds like direct economic devastation.
It was. The introduction of cheap English-manufactured articles had ruined native artisans, weavers, cotton dressers, carpenters, blacksmiths, shoemakers, and many others. Their traditional crafts were being undermined, throwing them out of work and reducing them to beggary.
And the promise to them.
That under the Badshahi government, native artisans would exclusively be employed in the service of the kings, the rajas, and the rich, ensuring their prosperity. They were urged to renounce English service.
Finally, for the pundits, fakirs, and other learned persons, the religious and intellectual class, the central grievance was religious.
Yes. They saw the Europeans as direct enemies of both the Hindu and Mohammedan religions and declared that the war was fundamentally on account of religion. Their duty, as prescribed by the proclamation, was to present themselves and take part in the holy war, or jihad.
This proclamation is incredibly revealing. It shows that the rebellion wasn't driven by a single issue, but a complex mix of grievances, economic, social, political, and religious, affecting nearly every segment of society.
Absolutely. From the landholding elite to urban artisans and religious scholars, it also highlights the conscious effort to appeal to these diverse groups and unite them under a common banner of resistance against the British.
We also have a rare surviving document that gives us a direct voice from the sepoys themselves, a petition, an artsy, from rebel sepoys.
Yes, source 6. In this petition, the sepoys recount their long history of loyal service to the British, emphasizing that they had never made any excuses or pretenses nor revolted, sacrificing thousands of lives and conquering territories for the East India Company. They felt betrayed.
For them, the absolute breaking point was explicitly the order to use the new cartridges and muskets from England.
They stated clearly, in the former of which the fats of cows and pigs were mixed, and also that atta of wheat mixed with powdered bones was to be eaten. This was the direct violation of their faith and caste purity.
They described the brave resistance of the sowars, the cavalry troopers of the 3rd Light Cavalry who refused to bite the cartridges,
Stating that their religion and faith would be destroyed.
and they detail the harsh public punishment meted out. 3 regiments were paraded, surrounded by British and European troops and artillery, and 84 troopers were made prisoners and put in jail with irons.
They interpreted this brutal act as the British intention, to frighten us into biting the new cartridges. Their response, they state, was not fear, but unity and defiance. We and all our countrymen, having united together, have fought the British for the preservation of our faith.
They state they have been fighting for 2 years in order that our faith and religion may not be polluted.
Yes, the petition ends with a powerful, resonant line that encapsulates their motivation. If the religion of a Hindu or Muslim is lost, what remains in the world? For them, this wasn't just about land or power. It was a fight for the very core of their identity.
Compare the reasons given here by the sepoys, centered intensely on the religious threat, with the reasons given by the Talukdar Hanwant Singh, focused on land and the king. And compare them again with the Azamgar proclamation's wide range of grievances.
While there's an overarching theme of driving out the British and protecting their world, the specific emphasis shifts depending on which group is voicing their complaints, highlighting the layered motivations behind the widespread rebellion.
Beyond these precious few written sources, the rebels' actions themselves also reveal what they wanted, providing another layer of insight.
Definitely. Source 3.2 makes this point. The sources note that the rebels showed a complete rejection of everything associated with British rule or Farangi Raj. This wasn't just targeted violence, it was an attack on the symbols and structures of British power.
They also condemned the British policies of annexation and the breaking of treaties,
solidifying the perception that the British could not be trusted.
The key grievances that drove large numbers of people to action were the British land revenue system, which systematically dispossessed landholders and peasants,
and the influx of foreign commerce, which ruined traditional Indian artisans.
The core desire, the sources argue, was fundamentally conservative. To restore that world, the familiar, cherished way of life, the existing social and political order that had been dismantled and destroyed by nearly every aspect of British rule over the preceding decades.
This connected back directly to the fear of conversion and the deep motivation to fight for their livelihood, their faith, their honor, their identity. It was a fight which they perceived as being for the greater public good, protecting the collective community and its values from an alien, destructive force.
What's particularly interesting is not just the attacks on the British, but the attacks on their perceived allies and local oppressors, particularly moneylenders and certain elites.
Yes, in many places, rebels specifically sought to humiliate these local elites and actively targeted moneylenders. They burned account books, literally destroying the records of debt and financial obligation under the new system, and ransacked moneylenders' houses.
This action, the sources suggest, wasn't just about settling old scores.
It seems it reflected an attempt to overturn traditional hierarchies, rebel against all oppressors, both British and Indian. It might even present a glimpse of an alternative vision, perhaps of a more egalitarian society, although this wasn't necessarily a fully articulated political philosophy in their broader, unity-focused proclamations.
More an expression of immediate desires for justice and reversal of the current order.
I think so, yes.
Once British rule collapsed in major centers like Delhi, Lucknow, and Kanpur, the rebel leadership did attempt to establish alternative authority structures, even if they were short-lived amidst the conflict.
It did try, yes. Source 3.3 discusses this. While these structures were temporary, they offer insight into the goals of the rebel leaders. Their aim seems to have been primarily to restore the pre-British world of the 18th century, specifically drawing inspiration from the culture of the court and the administrative practices that existed before British dominance.
They took concrete steps.
Yes, making appointments to administrative and military posts, attempting to arrange for revenue collection, essential for funding the war effort, organizing payment for troops, issuing orders against looting and plunder to maintain some semblance of order, making plans for battles, and trying to lay down clear chains of command in their armies.
In all these actions, they were clearly harking back to the 18th century Mughal world.
A world that became a symbol of all that had been lost and that they wished to regain. These structures were largely focused on meeting the immediate demands of the ongoing war.
And in Awad, where the resistance proved most enduring, plans for counterattacks and command hierarchies were still being developed and implemented as late 1857 and early 1858.
Yes, showing a sustained effort to build a functioning alternative government, even under siege.
So putting together the proclamations, petitions, actions, and attempts at governance, we see that the rebels wanted to drive out the British Ferengies, protect their religion and way of life from perceived threats, redress a complex web of economic and social grievances related to land and livelihoods, and restore a familiar pre-British order symbolized strongly by the Mughal court culture and older systems of authority.
That seems a fair summary of their core aims based on what we can glean. Now let's pivot to the British side, how they responded to this massive, unprecedented uprising and managed to suppress it.
Because the courses make it clear it was a difficult and brutal process.
Extremely difficult and extremely brutal. The initial response was swift legal action to consolidate power and authorize harsh measures. In May and June 1857, the British passed a series of new laws effectively putting the whole of North India under martial law.
This granted extraordinary powers.
Yes. Military officers and even ordinary Britons were given the authority to try and punish any Indian suspected of rebellion. Crucially, ordinary processes of law and trial were suspended, meaning summary justice was the norm, and the standard punishment for rebellion was simply death. No due process.
Armed with these new legal powers and reinforced by troops diverted from other parts of the British Empire,
like those intended for a war in Persia and reinforcements from Britain itself,
the British began their counterattack. They recognized the symbolic importance of Delhi, just as the rebels had, and mounted a two-pronged assault to retake North India.
One force advancing from Calcutta in the east and another from the Punjab in the west, which had remained largely peaceful.
Retaking Delhi proved to be a protracted and bloody affair.
Very. The siege lasted from early June to late September, involving heavy fighting and significant losses on both sides. This was partly because rebels from all over North India had converged on the city to defend the symbolic capital.
Progress in reconquering the heartland, the Gangetic Plain, was slow and difficult.
Extremely. The British had to fight to reconquer areas village by village. British reports cited in the sources frequently describe the countryside and the local population as entirely hostile, indicating the widespread nature of the rebellion.
It quickly became apparent to the British command that this was far more than just a military mutiny.
Yes, they were dealing with an uprising that has huge popular support, deeply embedded in the civilian population. This was nowhere more evident than in Awad,
where that official, Forsyth, estimated that 3/4 of the adult male population was in rebellion.
An astonishing figure. It took the British until March 1858, nearly a year after the outbreak, to fully control Awad, after exceptionally protracted and fierce fighting.
The British response involved the use of military power on a gigantic scale, but they also employed non-military strategies, didn't they?
Yes, to break the rebellion's back and dismantle the unity they observed, particularly in areas like Uttar Pradesh, where landholders and peasants had joined forces.
What kind of strategies?
A key tactic was a policy of conditional leniency combined with punishment. They promised to return their confiscated estates to big landholders who would remain loyal to the British or who now agreed to submit.
But rebel landholders
were permanently dispossessed of their lands. This strategy aimed to break the alliance between elites and peasants by offering incentives for loyalty and severe penalties for continued resistance. Many prominent rebel landholders either died fighting or were forced to flee to Nepal, where they often died in exile.
Source 7 gives us a vivid account of the resistance in rural Awad from the perspective of a British officer.
Yes, he describes the difficulties faced in dealing with villagers who were nearly intangible to Europeans, capable of melting away before them and collecting again elsewhere. Hit-and-run tactics, essentially.
He recounts encountering large numbers of men, described as a very large number of men, with a number of guns, likely armed villagers and retainers,
Exactly, indicating the scale of the popular uprising. What does this description tell you about the nature of resistance in the countryside? It wasn't always conventional warfare or frontal battles?
No, it was also elusive, dispersed, deeply rooted in the local population, involving guerrilla tactics, and making it incredibly challenging for the more conventional British forces to decisively defeat and suppress.
Precisely. How do we know all this today, especially given the scarcity of rebel accounts? As we've discussed, we rely heavily on British sources.
These include the official records generated by colonial administrators and military men, their letters, diaries, autobiographies, and published histories written shortly after the event.
We also have the British official mindset reflected in government memos, notes, and reports. And significantly, British newspapers and magazines played a huge role in shaping public opinion back home.
How so?
These publications often, quote, narrated in gory detail the violence of the mutineers, and these stories inflamed public feelings and provoked demands of retribution and revenge in Britain. They sensationalized it.
Another absolutely crucial source category is the pictorial images produced by the British during and immediately after the revolt.
Yes, paintings, drawings, etchings, posters, and political cartoons. While there are historical records, they weren't just neutral depictions. They were powerful representations intended to provoke specific emotions, convey particular messages, and shape narratives about the events. Propaganda, essentially.
Let's look at some examples provided in the sources, noting the different emotions and messages they aim to convey. One key category is celebrating the saviors.
Right. These images were created to commemorate the British heroes who supposedly saved British lives and suppressed the rebellion. Thomas Jones Barker's 1859 painting, Relief of Lucknow, is a prime example.
It depicts the dramatic moment when General Colin Campbell's forces arrived to relieve the besieged British garrison trapped in the Residency at Lucknow.
Yes, and the sources describe the composition. Key British heroes like Campbell, Havelock, Outram, and Lawrence, though Lawrence had died earlier, are prominently centered. Their gestures often direct the viewer's eye, and strong lighting highlights them.
In the background is the damaged Residency, symbolizing the hardship endured, while the foreground often includes dead or injured figures, and triumphant horses emphasize British power restored.
The clear message of this painting was a story of survival against the odds, heroic British resistance, and ultimate triumph. For the British public back home, such paintings were deeply reassuring, designed to signal that the time of trouble was past, and that their forces had emerged victorious, reaffirming British dominance.
Another powerful category focused on English women and the honor of Britain.
Yes, the sensationalized newspaper tales of violence or the threat of violence against British women and children became a huge emotional driver back in Britain, fueling intense demands for ruthless revenge and the protection of British honor and safety. Artists channeled and shaped these sentiments.
Joseph Null Peyton's 1859 painting, In Memoriam, is a striking example.
It is. It depicts a group of English women and children huddled together, looking vulnerable, helpless, and innocent, seemingly awaiting a terrible fate. The sources suggest dishonor, violence, and death.
But it doesn't actually show the violence.
No, the painting deliberately suggests violence without explicitly showing it, aiming to stir maximum anger and fury in the viewer. The rebels, though invisible in the main scene, are implicitly portrayed as violent and brutish, while British forces appear in the background, arriving as saviors.
However, British women were also sometimes portrayed heroically, pushing back against the image of passive victimhood.
True. An illustration depicting Miss Wheeler defending herself against sepoys in Campor shows a single British woman actively fighting back, described as single-handedly killing 4 burly males with swords and guns.
This image serves multiple purposes. It demonizes the rebels as brutish figures easily defeated by a lone woman.
And it links to women's struggle for personal honor and survival to a broader defense of Christianity, often symbolized by a Bible lying on the floor. It connects personal honor to national and religious honor in a powerful visual narrative.
The anger and shock in Britain led to overwhelming demands for vengeance and retribution.
Yes, and visuals produced during this time actively sanctioned ruthless oppression and brutal reprisals, aiming to demonstrate British power and invincibility. An allegorical figure of justice, published in the satirical magazine Punch in 1857, is a good example.
What does it show?
A female figure representing justice holding a sword and shield, depicted with an aggressive posture and a face full of rage, actively trampling on prostrate sepoys while Indian women and children cower nearby. It's incredibly aggressive.
So this imagery clearly sanctioned brutal repression and violent reprisal in the eyes of the British public.
Absolutely. Other similar images and cartoons in the British press, like the British Lion's vengeance on the Bengal tiger, another one from Punch in 1857, used potent symbolism.
The British lion versus the Bengal tiger.
Exactly. The lion representing Britain, overpowering and crushing the tiger, representing India or the rebellion itself. These often include figures of helpless women or children to justify the violence of the lion's vengeance.
The urge for vengeance wasn't just depicted, it was performed. The British carried out brutal public execution methods.
Horrifically so, most famously blowing rebels from the mouths of cannons or hanging them. Images of these executions were circulated widely, not just as news, but deliberately to instill terror in the Indian population.
Illustrations like execution of mutineers in Peshawar, blowing from the guns from the Illustrated London News.
And another titled Execution of Mutinous Sepoys in Peshawar depict these scenes almost like a public spectacle, a stage for retribution. British soldiers, and crucially other sepoys, were often forced to watch, experiencing the chilling consequences firsthand.
This wasn't just routine punishment, it was a performance of terror.
Exactly. Theatrically carried out in the open to maximize its psychological impact and deter future resistance. Pure terror tactic.
Amidst this public clamor for vengeance, anyone suggesting a more lenient approach faced ridicule and scorn.
Yes, when Governor General Canning, who perhaps had a slightly more nuanced view, suggested a policy of moderation and clemency to try and win back loyalty among the population, he was widely mocked in the British press.
There's that famous cartoon in Punch, The Clemency of Canning.
Right. It satirized his approach. It shows Canning as a father figure with a protective hand placed over a sepoy. But the sepoy is deliberately depicted holding a bloody sword and dagger, portraying him as inherently untrustworthy, violent, and still dangerous, despite Canning's gesture of mercy.
So the cartoon vividly demonstrates the public and press's overwhelming rejection of any form of leniency or mercy towards the rebels.
It really does. These British images celebrating saviors, portraying helpless victims and brutish villains, sanctioning vengeance, and demonstrating the performance of terror paint a powerful but very specific picture of the revolt. However, this is not the only way the event has been represented.
No, later in the 20th century, the burgeoning Indian national movement began to reinterpret and draw inspiration from the events of 1857, creating its own powerful imageries and narratives.
A complete counter-narrative emerged. The revolt was actively celebrated and recast as the first war of independence against British rule. This nationalist narrative emphasized the unity of all sections of the people of India: Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, princes, peasants, soldiers fighting together against a common foreign oppressor.
Art, literature, and historical writing produced during the nationalist movement actively worked to keep the memory of the revolt alive.
Presenting the rebel leaders not as mutinous villains, but as heroic figures leading the country into battle for freedom.
Rani Lakshmi Bai of Jhansi, in particular, became an enduring icon of nationalist resistance.
Absolutely. Heroic poems celebrated her courage and valor, portraying her as fighting fiercely for the freedom of her motherland. She was often described as a masculine figure, slaying British soldiers and fighting valiantly until her last breath, embracing death over surrender.
The famous line from a popular poem, Kublari Mardani, Wo tu Hansi wali Raniti,
which translates to, like a man she fought, she was the Rani of Kansi, became synonymous with her image. Popular prints and illustrations depicted her in battle armor, wielding a sword, riding a charging horse, transformed into a powerful symbol of the determination to resist injustice and alien rule for generations of Indian nationalists.
These contrasting sets of images, both British and Indian, didn't just passively reflect existing emotions or historical facts.
Well, they actively shaped sensibilities. The British images helped to justify and sanction the brutal repression and reinforce the narrative of British superiority. The nationalist images, conversely, helped to forge a sense of shared history, unity, and purpose, shaping the nationalist imagination and mobilizing people for future struggles against colonial rule.
And this, we think, is an important insight these visual representations offer. How do these contrasting images allow us to identify the underlying perspective of the artist, the intended audience, and the specific message they were trying to convey?
It's clear, isn't it? The British images were created for a public demanding vengeance and reassurance of their power, while the nationalist images were created for a public seeking inspiration and a narrative of unified resistance to build a future nation.
It demonstrates how history is not just a list of facts, but also about how events are perceived, remembered, interpreted, and used to construct identity and meaning for different groups over time.
highlighting the enduring power of storytelling in shaping our understanding of the past.
So what does this all mean when we look at the 1857 revolt through the lens of the sources you've shared? We've seen it was a complex event, far more than a simple mutiny.
Definitely. It was fueled by a layered mix of deep-seated grievances, economic, social, religious, and political, going back decades, and ignited by immediate triggers like the Cartridges and rapidly spreading rumors.
It involved incredibly diverse groups and leaders, from the last vestiges of the Mughal court and dispossessed landholders to dynamic local cultivators and religious figures, resulting in widespread popular resistance.
This resistance was particularly fierce and long-lasting in places like Arad, precisely because of the specific acute local factors related to land, loyalty to the displaced Nawab, and the strong links between sepoys and their villages.
We've also seen the sheer brutality and scale of the British repression required to crush the uprising, and how the event was immediately and subsequently framed through dramatically contrasting narratives.
The British narrative of triumph, vengeance, and restoring order versus a later Indian nationalist narrative celebrating unity, heroism, and resistance against foreign rule. Two completely different stories from the same events.
It underscores the vital importance of looking at multiple sources and perspectives. British accounts, limited rebel voices, economic data, social observations, visual propaganda to understand historical events, especially those with such contested and powerful legacies.
The British and nationalist images, in particular, visually demonstrate that history is deeply intertwined with how events are perceived, remembered, and used to construct identity and meaning, highlighting the enduring power of storytelling in shaping our understanding of the past.
And here's a final thought for you to mull over, something to take away from this deep dive. How do the powerful images and narratives created during and immediately after pivotal historical events like the Revolt of 1857 continue to influence our understanding of history, national identity, and even international relations today?
What other historical events can you think of that have such dramatically different visual or written legacies, and what does that tell us about the ongoing process of interpreting and using the past?
It's a question that extends far beyond 1857, reminding us that history is a living, contested space of memory and meaning.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's a wrap on this deep dive into the complex world of rebels and the Raj, understanding the Revolt of 1857.